We have called this episode Self-Government and Consent of the Governed.
Hello, this is Avery Mann again. We're back with our regular programming, our regular series, Common Good, Common Sense, and our series called Self-Government and Consent of the Governed. Patrick Henry interrupted our sequence to deliver his review of the recent book by Andrew Weissman called Liar's Kingdom. Great title. If you haven't watched it, please do. Or better, read the book. Or better yet, do both. Anyway, we added this episode, and we're calling it Human Factors Politics, because the subject is larger than we realized. We thought we would have covered it in the episode before this one, before Patrick Henry's too. The main reason we added it because former President John Adams inserted in an assignment to our project. He wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, the original one, but he attended the one we conducted here in 2026. And he had some good contributions. Wish we'd had him in 1787, but we got him now. So this is what he presented in broad form. He was a big advocate of educating the public, preparing the public to act responsibly in a republic. And a republic is a lot more like a democracy than the republic we formed, but I mean, anyway, a democracy and a republic are pretty similar. But we're going with his advice to make recommendations for how to prepare the public to perform in a society that is self-governing. To recap, our 2026 U.S. Constitutional Convention, 2026 one, analyzed the political predicaments in the United States today, and they identified two core sources of unrest in America. The first is cultural identity, epistemological, differences in people. That is what we believe and why we believe what it is we believe. The second track that they identified is structural problems. And we're focusing mostly on those from a constitutional perspective. I want to warn you with that. How our society and government are structured and operate. It may be hard for people to accept that there are problems with our beloved Constitution, and I'm among you who loves the Constitution. It tried to accomplish some great principles. So in our curriculum for how to prepare citizens to participate in a responsible way in contributing to a society and a government that operates itself rather than calling on someone else to put things straight. We found there are different ways to kind of break down this whole thing about culture and ideologies and moral values and power. And I've kind of hit on all of those. So we broke those down, and I'm going to flash through what some of these models, I mean, lots of thinkers and political scientists and others have presented ideas about how to analyze our circumstances in this epistemological way. So in terms of ideology, or I, from a Freudian perspective, like to say ideology, because that's where it comes from. Anyway, there's the political compass. I suspect many of you are familiar with this one. It's got an image of it here. And all of these models we're going to talk about compare two dimensions on a whatever two-dimensional chart, up and down, and the political compass compares a person. You rate yourself on where you think government should be in terms of authority and control versus liberty and freedom. And on the other dimension, it's the old classical economic one about communism and capitalism. So this is one that ideological dimensions include economics, authority, state power, hierarchy, freedom, and government structure. So the second dimension is that our group identified in terms of epistemological or human factors, politics that we call it, is culture. And that one is a big one in the common media, cultural differences. There's one model that's quite well accepted in the literature and political science academia, called the Engelhardt-Wenzel model, and it talks about traditional versus secular and rational beliefs on one dimension, and on the other is self-expression versus values, and whether that's important to the person. That gets pretty involved, and something that we believe that John Adams would like public to learn about before they try to engage in meaningful political conversations. There's another model that's kind of similar called the Hofstede model, and how cultures differ in terms of social values and norms and behaviors, and kind of similar attitudes toward behavior, individualism, uncertainty, about ambiguity about what's going on in the world, what the meaning of the world of reality is, and so forth, and self-restraint. But this one, I think you can understand is clearly important in today's world. The third dimension is one that particularly interests me, and that is morality. The main reason for my interest is there's a fellow named Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-G-H-T, who wrote the book The Righteous Mind, quite popular back in 2012, and he's come up with moral foundations theory, and got a chart here that shows 6 of his basic moral foundations, which are care for one another, fairness or justice, loyalty, authority, purity, and liberty. The chart here we're putting up, if you want to pause and look at it, shows one of the graphs is labeled U. It's made up, but what to look at is that it compares liberals and conservatives and libertarians. And you'll find some interesting similarities between liberals and libertarians, that surprised me, and some features about conservatives, basically, that they really value the morals of loyalty, authority, and purity far above the other two groups, which, just a thought. So that's kind of my favorite one on morality. There's Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory, and ranks cultures, ranks morality on a bunch of other dimensions, which I'm showing here. And the last, no, not the last two, there's it gets more complex. Shalom Schwartz's theory of basic human values or universal human values system. And these start getting, you got to think seriously about yourself and your values and what other people think, and evaluate things in a different way than we're used to. Last, in terms of the moral stages of things, is a model called Kohlberg's moral stages, and this one basically follows how kids progress through different moral values, and it's also kind of instructive. But all right, so that's morals. So here we've reviewed three of the epistemological dimensions that divide Americans, and that's ideologies, cultures, and morals. We reviewed all of them, I believe, briefly, but it may have seemed fairly long. But this is, we wanted to present this content in a quick fashion because it works with Adam's proposal to that the nation should create a curriculum to prepare Americans and set up some institutions where Americans can actually work towards self-government in a process we might call a real democracy. So a important part of this, to work together, to understand each other, talk about things political, we believe it's pretty obvious that people have to understand themselves, come to terms with it, what their beliefs are, have more patience and understanding with other people's beliefs, and that's what a lot of that content about the epistemological stuff deals with. So that's the idea there. So those are the ideology, culture, and morals are the three emotional factors that weigh in here with the human factors politics. But the committee and the delegates came up with a fourth important dimension, and that is power. I've spoken long enough here. So now I hand the podium over to our leader, Thomas Paine.
Thank you, Avery, for coping with all those emotions and opinions that we all argue about. Dimension 4. Power. You reviewed 3 dimensions of beliefs that affect the political climate. However, there is another dimension we must weigh in politics, and that is power. Power is the 4th dimension of the American cultural political landscape. We define power as how people believe power should be structured, justified, and exercised. Again, we are working from the idea there are 2 root causes of America's woes: epistemology and structure. Basically, structure is power, and power is how societies govern their citizens. For the past 4 or so decades, the U.S. government hasn't been governing the people, it's been dividing we, the people, and keeping itself tied in deadlock in the process. This means government doesn't do much but to make a fuss. Let's consider political power in the United States on 3 levels. At the top is the federal government, next are the states, and third, the people. Or, the judicial branch is third, making the people fourth. The United States calls itself united, but it is divided into red and blue at every level. The federal government is divided, and the states are divided, red and blue. Some states are equally divided, and they are swing states. So those states decide elections. That is due to the Electoral College. That was another tactic the founders created to put people below the states. Even the judicial department is divided by party. The theory was that principles of law and justice would unite the judiciary. It is a nice idea, not reality. And last, the people are divided. However, the people of the United States are united in one respect. We are unhappy with how our government operates. Our group thinks this point is self-evident. It's up to us, the people, to fix it. And to do that, we need to get our minds together. Our government and political system are acting against the people's common interests, which is to work to reach agreements. Let's demand our government help us cooperate rather than promote domestic terrorism. Speaking of power, I believe that much of the torment of the American people is they feel powerless. This creates frustration, which leads to anger and aggression. The people have no way to influence government. You might reply, we can vote. We answer, yes, but who decides who you vote for? And worse, how does it matter if you vote when the outcome is already decided? We will discuss the American electoral system in a future episode. Here we argue that a republic and a democracy cannot fight itself for domination. A republic and a democracy cannot divide and fight itself for domination. Instead, the people must agree how they choose to be governed. However, if our society and political system work to keep us divided, it keeps the political parties and their sponsors in control, and the people without power. The third purpose of the Constitution, in of our preamble, is promote domestic tranquility. We should expect and demand that government serves to unite us rather than work to divide us. The federal government, in theory, is run by three equal branches: the legislative, executive, and the judicial. According to Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and me, the order of power should be the people, government, and the judiciary, in that order. None of us were present in the original Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. In our reenactment in 2026, we determined that if we three had been present in 1787, things would have come out differently. The Bill of Rights would have come front and center, not added as an afterthought. Jefferson would have insisted that the people would have more influence in government. Henry would have required limitations of executive power, and I have supported all 3 points. Besides that, had John Adams been there, he would have proposed a public education system to develop citizens to participate in self-government. And 4 of us would have helped him propose systems and social institutions to promote public participation in government. So we close this discussion of epistemology by reviewing power, which transitions into Franklin's discussions of the structure of the Constitution, and thus how power is assigned and limited in that central document of government. But before that, we want to close this portion with a broad discussion of human nature in an evolutionary perspective. So, now I turn the chair back to Avery, who will introduce our next guests. Avery.
Thank you, Payne. Thus, we call this episode Human Factors Politics, and we close this with power, which, along with human nature, is what politics is all about. But human nature is a much huger subject than we've talked about. Human nature covers trillions of minuscule nerve connections in our brains that create our consciousness and awareness of ourselves and the cosmos and one another and ideals. So we'll end this episode with a couple of discussions about human nature on a broad and general perspective of human evolution itself. And there's no better person, we believe, that to bring science and human nature smack into contact, and that is Charles Darwin. We all know who Charles Darwin is, and so here he is. I introduce to you the famous Charles Darwin.
Darwin. Thank you, Mr. Mann. My first comments have to do with how people reacted to my theory in 1859. When I published On the Origin of Species, I endured fierce criticism from religious authorities, social traditionalists, and even some scientists. They believed my theory degraded human uniqueness and morality. I never understood that outlook. Our genes are bound to other species, even plants, which enhances my being as a part of God's living nature and between one another. Some turned my theory to justification for ruthless competition, even fascism and genocide. I abhor the term social Darwinism. Some have used it for inhumane practices, euphemistically called eugenics. I believe the record of our species supports that we adapted first for cooperation. We evolved for life in small groups where loyalty, conformity, cooperation, and competition all contributed to survival. Modern democratic societies require humans to sustain peaceful cooperation among millions of strangers, each possessing different identities, beliefs, and interests. That is a scale of social organization for which nature did not prepare us. The fact that people can go about life normally amongst complete strangers persuades me that we are exceptionally tolerant to crowded conditions. It would throw most animals into panic or into exhibitions of smelling one another's anuses and genitals. Modern biologists have adopted the idea of evolutionary mismatch, which I accept fully. Your next guest, Dr. Wilson, will have more to say about that. I believe that the greatest change in conditions for humans over the past 5,000 years is the degree of risk, or the disparity of risk between now and almost all our evolution. Humans developed civilizations perhaps 7,000 years ago. They provided a degree of protection, with shelters and protection from predators. However, most people had no rights except to labor to serve the Holy Emperor, the privileged, and feed themselves. Famine, disease, or a significant injury could end everything. Perhaps 10% of all humanity lived in these civilized conditions, while most lived outside the gates in hunter-gatherer tribes, living on razor's edge. In any case, 7,000 years is far too short for a species to evolve significant behavioral changes. That's what? 1/1000th of our evolutionary history. It takes tens or hundreds of thousands of years unless there is a global catastrophe. Imagine yourself as a member of a Paleolithic tribe in a hunting party, walking in a line across the savannah. You see stirring in the grass directly in front of you. No wind is blowing, so you hope it's a lamb, but it could be, or a lion. That was then, this is now. The ancient mind was programmed to prefer the safer mistake. If you fled from a lamb, little was lost but dignity and dinner. However, if you ignored a lion, all was lost. Natural selection therefore favored suspicion, quick fear, and overreaction. Thus, humans generally are more vigilant for and frightened by imagined dangers than attentive for opportunities. We still are that way, as science has proven. That trait makes us to miss many lambs, speaking in terms of my hunting metaphor. Society today is almost unrecognizable to my memory. I died more than 140 years ago, but in just the past 100 years, there are phenomenal advancements in security, protection, health, and comfort. From 1926 to today, there are some remarkable health statistics for the United States. A mother's chances of dying in childbirth in 1926 were 30 to 40 times higher than today. A child's chances of dying before age 1 in 1926 were 13 times higher than today. Before age 10, prospects of death were 10 to 20 times higher. Circumstances today pose very few risks. However, being risk-averse leaves us blind to opportunities. Modern democracy requires the opposite discipline. Citizens must not imagine every rival as a lion or every difference as an enemy. Our inherited caution once preserved life, but now modern media, parties and propaganda works to eliminate hope of self-government. The task before us is to design institutions that help our better nature govern our older fears. Can't government create incentives to bring people together in meaningful conversations and productive arguments? I am disheartened by what appears to be apathy or hopelessness of people in modern societies that we call free. The public increasingly calls for state control and power to assure safety and financial security. Our species has it in our power to make the world over again, to quote Mr. Paine. Proper education could prepare societies for self-government and develop institutions to promote it. Humans are a paradoxical primate in that we are suited to cooperate at exceptional levels, but if circumstances promote opposition, cooperation may reach its highest form to unite, to attack, and to annihilate an opposing group. The greatest modern rivalries and destruction arise not from material competition, but from social and symbolic differences perceived as intolerable threats. And that concludes my comments on your project at this point, Avery. Now, allow me the privilege to introduce your next guest. He recently joined us here in our version of Afterlife, Edward O. Wilson, famed social biologist.
Thank you, Charles Darwin. I must admit that it is an honor to have you introduce me. I was born in 1929 and died in 2021. I was an oddball kid. I often ventured through nature, studying the living world. I grew up in one of the most biologically rich regions in North America. I began to study different species in earnest, and ants became my great obsession. My interest widened to biodiversity, conservation, and the planetary scale. I began examining human societies as biological phenomena and created a new field of study, sociobiology. This is the evolutionary foundations of social behavior. I wrote of ants and man, addressing humanity's future. I began to consider our double nature that predisposes us to the most deeply rooted of all behaviors, tribalism. I graduated from the University of Alabama, home of the Crimson Tide. I call football ritualization of warfare, where opposing groups act as gladiators. I felt the tumult of emotions swell as thousands of voices lifted me into the collective spirit. This creates an ecstasy, almost religious. In fact, religion has its roots there. There are two other aspects of human nature to understand. One is that we have an intense need to believe we have achieved certainty or closure in our reality. The second is our emotional instability. We are impulsive to defense and anger. Paine asked me to comment on my most famous quote. The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. By Paleolithic emotions, I refer to tribalism and rage. But also, I mean the fundamental emotion of seeking. Our dopamine system keeps us going, to keep seeking. After basic survival, we seek recognition, dignity, identity, and moral certainty. We need cultural belonging because uncertainty produces anxiety. In my opinion, the challenge for human beings is to become aware of these inescapable scientific realities about ourselves. I should say something about medieval institutions like the state, the church, and universities. The basic hierarchies and dogmas of these systems largely continue. I am not qualified to offer suggestions on how to change them, but I suggest it may be time to consider doing that.
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Wilson. He's one of my favorite characters, by the way. We have discussed this question of epistemology, or people's beliefs and opinions, in considerable depth, I would say, when it comes to politics. That is because we human beings are exceptionally opinionated creatures, and we are extraordinarily complex and complicated. Indeed, some thinkers suggest that the most complex entity in the universe might be the human brain, which is basically to say us, human beings. And again, President Adams advised that to prepare citizens To engage in productive political discourse, it would be wise to train people to be self-aware, as well as to be adequately informed about human nature and the historical, sociological, and political forces that affect our political lives. Now, I hope that justifies what we've dealt with here. The next episode, in episode 6, we move from cultural and ideological factors to the more practical. We turn our attention to an aspect of power, and which is where the political rubber hits the public, you might say. Dr. Franklin will review the structure of our Constitution using what he calls his style of the Aristotelian method. Thank you. Dr. Franklin is critical of the Constitution. He was at the beginning. He said it wouldn't last long. Yeah, he's surprised now it lasted long as it did. He has since been influenced by Mr. Payne and Mr. Henry, who have convinced our committee of a radical principle. We don't think it's so radical, it is rational. A constitution is a document by the people defining how the people consent to be governed. So tune in next time, and thank you for your attention.